Thomas, a grieving widower in his 70s, had lived alone in the old family home for years. One stormy night, as thunder rattled the walls, he ventured into the attic to patch a leak. Beneath layers of dust and forgotten memories, he discovered a hidden door. Inside, the room was pristine, untouched by time. At its center hung a portrait of his late wife, Eleanor. Her painted eyes seemed alive, following him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. But why was this here? Thomas had lived in the old house for over 5 decades. Every corner of the place was steeped in memories, echoes of laughter and whispers of sorrow. After Eleanor passed away 5 years ago, the house grew quieter, lonelier. He found himself avoiding the attic, a place where forgotten things were kept and memories lingered in the dust. But the storm that night left him no choice. The rain hammered the roof like an unrelenting drumbeat, and water leaked through the ceiling in the hallway. With a heavy sigh, Thomas climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, lantern in hand. The air grew colder as he ascended, and the faint scent of mildew tickled his nose. The attic was just as he remembered, cluttered with old trunks, furniture draped in white sheets, and boxes stacked high, threatening to topple over. As he inspected the roof for leaks, his lantern's light flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. That was when he noticed it, a seam in the wooden wall that shouldn't have been there. Curiosity stirred in his weary heart. Setting the lantern down, he brushed his hand over the wall. The seam was barely visible, hidden beneath layers of grime. With a bit of effort, he pushed against the panel, and it gave way with a soft groan. Behind the hidden panel was a small door, its brass handle tarnished with age. Thomas hesitated, his heartbeat quickening. What could be behind it? Slowly, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room inside was unlike the rest of the attic. It was pristine, untouched by dust or time. A faint floral scent lingered in the air, one he immediately recognized. It was Eleanor's favorite perfume. At the center of the room stood an easel, and on it was a portrait. Thomas's breath hitched as he stepped closer, the lantern's light illuminating the painting. It was Eleanor. Her likeness was so lifelike, so vivid, that for a moment he thought she might step out of the frame. She was younger in the portrait, her eyes sparkling with the same warmth that had drawn him to her all those years ago. But as he stared, a chill ran down his spine. Her painted eyes seemed alive, almost aware. They followed him as he moved, their gaze unwavering. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again, but the sensation remained. He tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to his imagination, but the unease clung to him like a shadow. He noticed something else, a small table beside the easel with a single, leather-bound journal resting on it. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The journal was unmarked, but as he flipped through its pages, he recognized Eleanor's handwriting. The entries were dated years before her death, yet she had never mentioned writing a journal. The first few pages were filled with musings about life and love, notes on their travels, and sketches of the garden she adored. But as he read on, the tone shifted. The entries grew darker, more introspective. Eleanor wrote about feeling watched, even when she was alone. She mentioned hearing whispers at night and seeing shadows that didn't belong. Thomas's pulse quickened as he turned to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, the words scribbled as if in a rush. "Thomas, if you find this, I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was inviting into our lives. The portrait, it isn't just paint and canvas. There's something inside it, something I can't explain. I've tried to destroy it, but I can't. It feels like a part of me is trapped in there. Please forgive me. Please set me free." The lantern flickered again, the flame dimming. Thomas looked back at the portrait, his heart pounding. Eleanor's eyes, her painted eyes, seemed to shimmer with unshed tears. A gust of wind, cold and biting, swept through the room, extinguishing the lantern. Darkness enveloped him, but he swore he heard it, a faint, sorrowful whisper calling his name. Shaken, Thomas fumbled to relight the lantern. His fingers trembled as he struck a match, its tiny flame illuminating the enclosed space once more. When the light returned, his gaze was drawn immediately to the painting. The expression on Eleanor's face seemed to have changed. Her serene smile was now gone, replaced with an expression that teetered between sorrow and dread. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracking. The room remained silent, yet the air grew heavier, oppressive. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath. Memories of their life together came rushing back in vivid detail. Her laughter as they danced under the stars, her hand in his as they strolled through the garden, the way she would hum her favorite tune while painting by the window. But now, standing in this mysterious room, he felt the unbearable weight of her absence more than ever. He turned his attention back to the journal, desperate for answers. The final pages hinted at something deeper, something Eleanor had been too afraid to write plainly. "I've seen it," she had scrawled in one entry. "It watches me from the canvas. It knows my thoughts, my fears. I tried to stop him, but the artist, he said it was already done." Thomas closed the journal, his knuckles white as he gripped its worn leather cover. Who was this artist? And what had Eleanor meant by "it watches me"? He needed to understand, yet dread coiled in his stomach like a living thing. For the first time in years, he felt truly unmoored. The love of his life had carried secrets he could never have imagined. And now, it seemed, those secrets were coming for him too. Thomas could not shake the weight of the journal's words or the penetrating gaze of the portrait. Sleep became elusive that night. Every time he closed his eyes, Eleanor's painted face emerged, her expression pleading, her painted eyes following him into his dreams. When the sun rose, pale and sluggish, it did little to lift the dread coiled inside him. He needed answers. He began his search in the house, combing through Eleanor's belongings for anything that might explain her connection to the portrait. The attic became his focus. Every corner, every box, every trunk was inspected. Most of what he uncovered were remnants of their life. Photo albums, letters, keepsakes. But one chest contained something unexpected. A letter signed by Victor Malric. The name sent a jolt of recognition through him. Thomas remembered it from years ago in an art gallery Eleanor had insisted they visit. Malric had been a recluse, an enigmatic artist whose works were rumored to hold something deeper than paint. Eleanor had admired his pieces, marveling at how they captured the soul. The letter was yellowed, the ink faded but legible. It read, "Dearest Eleanor, I have completed the commission as you requested. You are a remarkable subject, and the final piece exceeds my expectations. As I promised, it holds a depth that will transcend time. However, this art demands reverence. Destroying it may bring unintended consequences. Trust your heart to guide you." Thomas sank onto the attic floor, his chest tightening. There was life in it? The words sounded absurd, but the way the painting's eyes followed him made him shudder. Eleanor had hidden this from him. Why? Days passed, and the house grew stranger. The faint scent of Eleanor's perfume lingered. Whispers filled the halls at night, and he felt the painting pulling at him, demanding his attention. Unable to resist, he returned to the hidden room. Moonlight illuminated the portrait, casting eerie shadows. Thomas's emotions surged. Love, grief, fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered to the painting, his voice breaking. The room remained silent, but the air grew heavier. He stepped closer, his fingers hovering near the canvas. It radiated warmth, like human skin. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. That night, he dreamed of Eleanor. She stood in a shadowy forest, pointing toward something hidden in the trees. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He tried to reach her, but the distance between them remained. He woke, drenched in sweat. Determined, Thomas decided to learn more about Malric. At the library, he combed through archives and found whispers of the artist's methods. Malric had been accused of dabbling in the occult, his paintings rumored to trap the essence of their subjects. Clients vanished, families fell apart. One article quoted a former assistant. He believed he could bind life to his art. He called it a gift, but it felt like a curse. Thomas slammed the book shut, his pulse racing. The portrait wasn't just a painting, it was something far darker, and Eleanor had willingly stepped into its grasp. That evening, Thomas sat alone in the parlor, the silence oppressive. He whispered to the empty room, "Eleanor, what have you done?" The following nights the whispers became louder, almost coherent, though their words eluded him. Shadows seemed to move in corners where no light reached. And still, the painting called to him. When he finally returned to the hidden room, he swore the expression on Eleanor's painted face had changed. The serene smile had faded, replaced by something sadder, more desperate. Another dream followed. This time, Eleanor spoke. Her voice, faint but unmistakable, carried words that chilled him to the core. "Thomas, free me," she said, her painted eyes glistening with tears. The next morning, Thomas revisited the letter. He read and reread the warning about unintended consequences. He turned to the library again, desperate for guidance. Another article mentioned a similar portrait. A man who had tried to burn it had died of unexplained causes days later. The painting was found intact, unharmed by the flames. His desperation grew. The occurrences in the house escalated. Once, while walking through the kitchen, Thomas heard Eleanor's voice humming her favorite tune. The sound stopped abruptly when he entered the room, leaving him shaken. Another night, he found their wedding photo, previously stored away, sitting upright on the mantelpiece, though he hadn't touched it in years. Finally, Thomas resolved to confront the painting directly. Sitting before it in the hidden room, he whispered, "Eleanor, if you can hear me, tell me what to do." He waited, the silence unbearable. He touched the canvas. It was warm, almost alive. The air around him grew colder, and he felt a presence, as though Eleanor was standing beside him. Her voice came again, soft and filled with sorrow. "Thomas," she said, "set me free." And then everything went black. When he woke, he was on the attic floor, his hands trembling. The painting remained untouched, but something had changed. An unmistakable warmth lingered in the room, like the ghost of her presence. He knew then what he had to do, but the path forward was cloaked in shadows. Thomas woke on the attic floor, his body trembling and cold. The sensation of Eleanor's voice still lingered in his ears, soft and sorrowful. His eyes were drawn to the portrait, still standing on the easel, its painted surface untouched but menacing. He felt it now, not just as an image, but as a presence. Eleanor was there, trapped, calling out to him. But how could he free her without losing her forever? The question haunted him as he descended the stairs. He could hardly eat or sleep, consumed by the weight of what he had learned. The days blurred together, each one bringing new signs of the portrait's power. The whispers grew louder, their words cryptic but constant. "The bond must break," they chanted. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and objects moved without explanation. The house felt alive, but not in a way that comforted him. It was as if Eleanor's plea had awakened something ancient. One night, as the rain battered the windows, Thomas resolved to act. He could not bear another day of uncertainty. The letter from Victor Malric had warned against destroying the painting, but it offered no alternative. He needed to find the artist, to confront him and demand answers. If Malric was still alive, he would know how to sever the bond without harming Eleanor. He searched through the library's records and old newspaper archives for any mention of Malric's whereabouts. Hours passed as he pieced together fragments of the artist's life. Malric had vanished decades ago, retreating to an isolated cabin deep in the woods. One article mentioned a region near Blackthorn Lake, a remote area shrouded in mist and legend. Armed with this lead, Thomas packed a small bag and set out the next morning. The journey was long and arduous, the roads winding and narrow, flanked by dense forest that seemed to close in around him. As he neared Blackthorn Lake, the air grew colder, the trees darker and more imposing. It was as if the land itself resisted his presence, warning him to turn back. But Thomas pressed on, driven by the image of Eleanor's face and the sound of her voice. When he arrived at the lake, the sight was both beautiful and eerie. The water stretched out like a sheet of glass, reflecting the gray sky above. A narrow path led into the woods, marked by an old, weathered sign that read, "Private Property." Thomas hesitated before stepping onto the path, his heart pounding. Each step felt heavier than the last, the forest around him growing darker as the canopy thickened overhead. After hours, he came upon a clearing. At its center stood a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered by time. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life within. Thomas approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the moss-covered ground. He knocked on the door, his knuckles trembling against the wood. The door creaked open, revealing a gaunt man with sunken eyes and gray hair that hung in unkempt strands. He looked at Thomas with suspicion, as though visitors were an unwelcome rarity. "You're Victor Malrick," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his stomach. It was not a question. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Thomas. My wife, Eleanor, commissioned a portrait from you years ago. I need your help." At the mention of Eleanor's name, Malrick's expression softened. His shoulders sagged and he stepped aside, motioning for Thomas to enter. The interior of the cabin was sparse and cluttered, filled with canvases, jars of paint, and books stacked precariously on every surface. The air smelled of turpentine and decay, a mix that made Thomas's stomach churn. Malrick gestured to a chair, and Thomas sat, his hands gripping his knees. The artist took the seat across from him, studying Thomas with a piercing gaze. "What do you want to know?" Malrick asked, his voice low and rasping. Thomas hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Finally he said, "Eleanor is trapped in the painting. I can feel her, hear her. She's asking me to free her. How do I do it?" Malrick closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face. "I warned her," he murmured. "I warned her what the painting would become. She didn't believe me. None of them ever do." "What do you mean?" Thomas demanded. "What is it? What have you done?" Malrick opened his eyes, fixing Thomas with a sorrowful stare. "It's not just paint and canvas. My art. It binds the soul of the subject, preserving them forever. It was meant to be a gift, a way to defy mortality. But it's a curse. The soul becomes trapped, unable to move on. The only way to free her is to destroy the painting. But—" he hesitated, his voice faltering. "But what?" Thomas pressed. "If you destroy it, you risk destroying her. The bond is delicate. If it breaks wrong, she'll be lost, not just to this world, but to any world. She'll cease to exist." The words hit Thomas like a blow. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, suffocating him. "There must be another way," he said, his voice trembling. Malrick shook his head. "I've tried. I've failed. The painting is the prison and the lifeline. It's both her salvation and her doom." Thomas left Victor Malrick's cabin with more questions than answers. The revelation about the painting and the soul it imprisoned weighed heavily on him. The warning echoed in his mind. Destroying the portrait might free Eleanor, but it could also erase her existence entirely. The risk was unbearable, but so was the thought of leaving her trapped in limbo. The journey back to his home was long and solitary. The mist around Blackthorn Lake clung to his car, reluctant to let him go, and the winding forest roads seemed darker than before. Thomas replayed Malrick's words in his head, searching for some hidden meaning, a clue he might have overlooked. But the artist's voice had been resolute. There was no guaranteed way to save Eleanor. It was a gamble, one Thomas was terrified to take. When he finally reached the house, it felt different. The whispers had grown louder in his absence, filling the halls with a mournful chorus. The air was thick, heavy with an unseen presence. He avoided the attic for as long as he could, but the pull of the portrait was undeniable. Eleanor was waiting. As he climbed the attic stairs, a strange calm settled over him. The door to the hidden room was ajar, the faint scent of her perfume wafting out like an invitation. Thomas stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the painting. Eleanor's expression had changed again. The sorrow in her painted eyes was now laced with fear, as though she knew the decision he faced. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice trembling, "what do I do?" The room remained silent, but the air seemed to hum with energy. He moved closer to the portrait, his hand hovering just above the surface. It was warm to the touch, almost pulsing, as though it were alive. He pulled back, fear and indecision knotting in his chest. Destroying it could free her, or it could end her forever. Was he willing to take that risk? Desperate for clarity, Thomas turned to the journal he had found in the attic. He flipped through its pages, hoping for guidance. Near the back, he found an entry he had overlooked before. It was dated only a few months before Eleanor's death. "I've seen it now," the entry read. "What Victor warned me about. The painting isn't just a reflection of me. It's a part of me. I feel it pulling, drawing me in. At first, it was comforting, like a place to escape. But now, it's something else, something darker. I don't know if I can resist it much longer. If anything happens to me, Thomas must never destroy it. He won't understand, but it's the only way to keep me safe." Thomas stared at the words, his hands shaking. She had known. She had known what the painting was doing to her, and she had chosen to keep it from him. But why? Was it fear? Guilt? Or had she believed, even then, that he wouldn't be able to save her? Driven by desperation, Thomas retrieved a knife from the kitchen. He returned to the attic, the blade shaking in his hand as he stood before the portrait. He raised it, poised to strike, but the weight of the decision paralyzed him. The painted eyes seemed to follow the knife's movement, their expression pleading. "I can't," he whispered, lowering the blade. "I can't risk losing you." But as he turned to leave, the whispers began again, louder than ever. They filled the room, pressing against him like a physical force. The air grew cold, and the light from his lantern flickered. In the chaos, he heard her voice again, clearer this time. "Thomas, please," she begged. "Don't let me stay here. Set me free." Tears streamed down his face as he turned back to the portrait. The knife felt heavy in his hand, the weight of his love and fear almost unbearable. "I don't know what to do," he cried. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." The room seemed to respond, the whispers intensifying until they were a deafening roar. The air around the painting shimmered, distorting like heat waves, and the scent of Eleanor's perfume grew stronger. Thomas fell to his knees, clutching the knife, his body racked with sobs. In that moment, he made his decision. He would do whatever it took to free her, no matter the cost. Rising to his feet, he approached the portrait, his hand steady now. He took one last look at Eleanor's painted face, her eyes filled with hope and fear. "I love you," he whispered, raising the knife. The moment the blade pierced the painting, a deafening scream filled the room. The canvas buckled and writhed as though alive, the colors swirling and twisting violently. A blinding light erupted from the portrait, forcing Thomas to shield his eyes. The scent of Eleanor's perfume intensified, mixing with the acrid smell of burning paint. Thomas stumbled back, his knees giving way as the light consumed the room. Through the chaos, he thought he saw her, Eleanor's figure emerging from the painting, her face radiant and free of sorrow. She reached out to him, her lips forming the words, "Thank you," before the light overwhelmed them both. When the light finally subsided, The room was silent. The painting lay in tatters, the canvas torn and smoldering. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound stillness. Thomas collapsed to the floor, his body trembling from exhaustion and relief. He felt a warmth envelop him, a presence he couldn't see but knew was there. "Eleanor," he murmured, tears streaming down his face. "You're free." For hours, Thomas sat in the attic, unable to leave. The weight of what he had done hung over him like a shroud, but so did a sense of peace. The house was quiet now, no longer filled with the oppressive presence that had haunted him. The painting's remnants lay scattered across the floor, lifeless and ordinary. As dawn broke, Thomas finally found the strength to rise. He made his way to the window, the first rays of sunlight spilling into the room. For the first time in years, he felt the warmth of hope. Eleanor was gone, but she was free, and in her freedom, he found a sliver of solace. With a deep breath, he whispered a final goodbye to the woman he had loved more than life itself. "I'll always love you," he said, his voice steady despite the tears. And as the morning light filled the attic, he knew he had made the right choice. The days that followed were a haze of grief and relief for Thomas. The painting was gone. Its remnants swept into a corner of the attic like the ashes of a memory too painful to confront. The house, once so heavy with whispers and shadows, now felt unnervingly still. For the first time in weeks, Thomas could move freely through its rooms without the suffocating sense of being watched. Yet the absence of that presence, a presence he now realized had been Eleanor, left him feeling hollow. He spent hours sitting by the window in their bedroom, looking out over the garden Eleanor had loved so much. It had grown wild in her absence, the flowers overrun by weeds, but there were still traces of her touch. A row of white lilies she had planted one summer, their blossoms stubbornly defying the chaos around them. Thomas found himself talking to her as he gazed out at them, his voice soft and filled with longing. "Eleanor, I hope you're at peace now," he said one evening, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I hope you're somewhere beautiful. I hope you can hear me." The words hung in the air, unanswered, but Thomas liked to imagine she could hear him. It gave him comfort, a small balm for the ache of her absence. He began tending to the garden again, pulling weeds and pruning the overgrown shrubs. It was a way to feel close to her, to honor her memory. Slowly, the garden began to look as it once had, vibrant and full of life. But the house remained silent, and Thomas wondered if he would ever truly feel her presence again. One afternoon, as he was trimming the roses, he found something unexpected. Beneath the soil at the base of one of the bushes, his spade struck something hard. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt with his hands until he uncovered a small wooden box. It was old and weathered, the wood softened by years underground, but it was still intact. He opened it carefully, his heart racing with curiosity. Inside was a collection of letters, their edges yellowed with age. Each one was addressed to him in Eleanor's delicate handwriting. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he pulled them out, his hands trembling. He sat back on his heels, the garden forgotten as he unfolded the first letter. "Dearest Thomas," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I can only hope you found the strength to do what I couldn't, to break the bond and set me free. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused you, for the secrets I kept. I thought I was protecting you, but now I see I was only delaying the inevitable." Thomas read through the letters one by one, tears streaming down his face. They were a chronicle of Eleanor's descent into the painting's grasp, her struggle to resist its pull. In one, she described the sensation of being drawn toward the portrait, as though it were a magnet and she were a piece of iron. In another, she wrote of her fear that she was losing herself, that soon there would be nothing left of the woman Thomas had loved. But there were also moments of hope, of love. In her final letter, she wrote, "Even in the darkness, you were my light. You gave me the strength to hold on for as long as I did, and now I hope you've given me the freedom to finally let go. Thank you, my love, for everything." Thomas sat in the garden long after the sun had set, the letters clutched to his chest. He felt as though Eleanor had reached out to him from beyond the veil, her words a bridge between their worlds. It was bittersweet, but it was also a gift. She was gone, but she had left him with her love, and that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his days. As the weeks turned into months, Thomas found a new rhythm to his life. He began to paint again, something he hadn't done since Eleanor's death. At first, it was difficult. Every stroke of the brush reminded him of her, of the joy they had shared in creating art together. But gradually, the act of painting became a solace, a way to express the emotions he couldn't put into words. One day, he decided to paint the garden. He set up his easel near the white lilies and began to work, his brush capturing the play of light and shadow on the petals. As he painted, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It was as though Eleanor were with him, her presence woven into the strokes of color and light. When the painting was finished, he stood back to admire it. It was unlike anything he had ever created before, vivid and alive, almost as though the garden itself had stepped onto the canvas. He hung it in the living room where the sunlight would catch it each morning. It was a reminder of Eleanor, but also of the life they had built together and the love that still remained. One evening, as he was locking up the house, he passed by the painting and thought he saw something, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned, his heart racing, but the painting was still. And yet, as he stood there, he felt a warmth, a presence that made his chest tighten with emotion. "Good night, Eleanor," he whispered, a small smile on his lips. And for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. Months passed, and life for Thomas began to take on a sense of normalcy he hadn't thought possible. The house, once oppressive with whispers and shadows, had become a sanctuary, a place where memories of Eleanor lingered not as ghosts but as comforting echoes. He threw himself into his painting, his days filled with vibrant colors and his evenings spent quietly in the living room, sipping tea beneath the garden painting that now hung over the mantel. But there were still moments when the past felt closer than he wanted to admit. One evening, as he was cleaning the attic, he found the remnants of the portrait he had destroyed. The torn pieces of canvas, once vibrant and alive, were now dull and lifeless, their edges curled and blackened as though burned. He hesitated before picking them up, half expecting some lingering presence to stir, but there was nothing. The pieces were just that, pieces of a memory he had already laid to rest. Yet, as he carried them down to dispose of them, something unusual happened. A small fragment slipped from his grasp, landing face up on the floor. Thomas knelt to pick it up, but froze when he saw what it held. It was a fragment of Eleanor's painted eye, and for the briefest moment he thought it blinked. He stared at it, his heart pounding, but the illusion passed as quickly as it came. Shaking his head, he told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a remnant of his grief. Still, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that some part of her still lingered. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. Thomas continued to paint, his work growing bolder and more vibrant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He dreamed of Eleanor often, her face illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight, her voice calling to him from the garden. "Thomas," she would say, her tone filled with both love and sorrow. "I need you." One night, unable to sleep, he went to the garden. The air was crisp and cool, the stars glittering above like scattered diamonds. He walked among the flowers, his footsteps soft on the dewy grass, until he reached the white lilies Eleanor had planted. He knelt beside them, his fingers brushing against their delicate petals. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Are you still here?" The stillness of the garden was his only answer, but then he felt it, a warmth, a presence that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The wind stirred, carrying the faintest scent of her perfume, and for a moment he thought he saw her standing among the flowers, her figure pale and ethereal. He reached out, his heart aching with longing, but she was gone before his fingers could touch her. The experience left him shaken, but also comforted. Eleanor was gone. Yes, but she was not lost. She lingered in the spaces they had shared, in the life they had built together. She was in the garden, in the house, in the very air he breathed. And perhaps that was enough. As the months turned into a year, Thomas decided to open the house to others. He began hosting art classes in the living room, sharing his passion with people from the community. The house, once so isolated and silent, came alive with laughter and conversation, the sound of brushes against canvas filling the space with a gentle rhythm. One afternoon, as he was cleaning up after a class, a young woman approached him. She was quiet and unassuming, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice soft. "I just wanted to thank you. Your class has been, well, it's been life-changing. I lost someone close to me recently, and painting has helped me feel close to them again. I just thought you should know." Thomas smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Art has a way of connecting us to the ones we've lost. I'm glad it's brought you some comfort." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, before she turned and left. Thomas stood there for a moment, his heart full. Eleanor had always believed in the power of art to heal, to bridge the gaps between worlds. In some small way, he felt he was honoring her by sharing that gift with others. That evening, as he sat beneath the garden painting, he felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A warmth, a presence. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation wash over him, and he thought he heard her voice. "Thank you, Thomas," it said, soft and filled with love, "for everything." Tears slipped down his cheeks as he opened his eyes, a smile trembling on his lips. "I love you, Eleanor," he whispered, and for the first time in a long while, he felt whole. As the years went by, Thomas continued to paint, to teach, to live. The house became a haven for artists and dreamers, its walls filled with their creations. And though Eleanor was gone, her presence remained, a gentle, loving shadow that watched over him, guiding him as he moved forward. And in the garden, the lilies she had planted bloomed brighter than ever, a testament to the life and love they had shared.